So I try to like, whenever I have kids sitting with me, I try to like let them know what's happening. I don't want them to just play and not participate. So I'll be like, hey, we're about to pray. And they're like, no, I don't want to do it. Or, hey, we're going to pray again. They're like, again? And it just reminds me of like my own, how I grew up. And not how I grew up, and like my own attitude with God. Have you ever had those moments where you're telling yourself, oh my gosh, I get to pray again. I hate that I have to pray so many times, right? We've all been there. It just happens that this is a child in the service, right? But how many times do we struggle ourselves with prayer? And if I was to say prayer unceasingly in your mind, you're thinking, what does unceasingly mean? Does that mean every single minute of the hour? Right? But if somebody loves God, then that should be kind of like easier, kind of like we were talking about at the Bible study yesterday, or what Dale was talking about this morning. Fruits of if you love God, you want to be like God. You want to do the things that Jesus did, right? He prayed a lot. So there's several things that I pick up as I'm like trying to work with his kids. And at one point, I told JJ, because we were doing what was it? He was doing like the time for where they do the collection. So I'm like, oh yeah, do you know what this is? He's like, no, I don't know. And I'm like, all right, this is where we give money to God. And he's like, what? Is he going up here in a portal and take it? And I don't even know how to answer the kid. I'm like, no. And then he's like, well, why should we give it to him? And I'm thinking, that's a good point. And then so I'm trying to like explain what the money is used for. So I'm like, yeah, well, we give it to God, and then the ministers will use it to, pay for the homeless, help the people that are homeless, give them food, pay for the lights, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, I give money to the homeless, so why not just go do that? And I'm thinking, well, that's a good point too. So the whole time I'm just like confused about how to answer this kid. But the one that got me the most was when it was time to like pray for the giving. I was like, all right, JJ, let's be quiet and pray. And he's like, no. And I'm like, no, we got to pray because we're in the house of God. Yeah, that's what I said. And then he said, what do you mean? Like, I don't see a bed. I don't see a couch. That sounds simple, right? But in his mind, he's thinking, well, if it's really God's house, it has to look like my house. Because if you go into a house, what are the characteristics of a house? The house has to look livable, right? If I enter the building and there's nothing in there, like an apartment, like how most guys live, and there's no bed, there's no living room, there's no TV, you almost say it's not. It is a building for sure, but is it a home, right? Is it a house? Well, you can argue that. In his mind, he's thinking, well, if God lives here, then I should see what God does or how God lives. And I remember I tried to explain to him because I was floored with that question. So I was like, well, God doesn't sleep. He didn't get it. He just went over his head. The one that made me laugh, he was like, well, I guess that makes sense. I guess that is his little pool. Like he went to the baptistry, like that's God's swimming pool. And I thought it was funny. But God told the Israelites when Solomon was about to build the temple, God says, is there any building that is there a building that can contain God's presence? Is God restricted by four corners and four walls? Is there such a thing as this is where God dwells? This is the temple where God dwells. That's it right there. That contains God. Right? And so when God is talking to Solomon and King David, I believe, when they're talking about like giving God something great, they're like, we want to build a temple for you. Historically speaking, gods dwell in temples, right? Or some of y'all are very familiar with Greek mythology, right? Where do the gods dwell? Mount Olympus, right? The gods always dwelt on top of the mountains. So if you're not driving, they didn't have cars, but if you're walking out there doing your thing, you look up at the mountain, and sometimes maybe the mountain is covered in clouds, right? Surely gods must live on the mountains because the mountains are up in the skies and the gods dwell in the skies, right? That thought is not original to the Greeks. That is also among the Near Eastern cultures, so where you have like the Canaanites, the Israelites, the Hebrews, blah, 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 Midianites, all those people, right? the gods dwelling in the mountain was a very common thing among people. Surely the gods must dwell up on the mountain where I see clouds. And so, even in other cultures, like up recently too, typically people associate mountains and, I guess, mountainous terrain with the dwelling of the gods. But for a lot of people, they thought, a lot of cultures and the Hebrews believed, well, we got, like I told you guys before, we must have a place where we can see our God, and that God has to be worshipped. And hence, we put our gods in temples. But when we build the temples, we build glorious looking temples. For whom does that profit the most? If I build a magnanimously built building, magnificent in all ways, laden with gold and all kinds of ornaments, for whom is that building being built? Let me try and restructure that. In building, where was I going? We put together brick upon brick, and we think our gods must dwell in a certain place. Okay, they've done this for Molech, they've done this for Baal, they've done this for the Asherah and all kinds of other gods, right? El, there's a god called El, which El Shaddai, you see that in Dr. Sneed's class. He goes on and on about it. But we build a house for our God, right? And we say our God is dwelling in this place. All right, let's assume God can fill the place. That, in my observation, is more for man than it is for God. You see what I just said? For God to dwell in a beautiful building sometimes gives credibility to the builder, because they can look at a magnificent building and think, oh, surely our God is honored by this, right? But the point I'm trying to make is, no matter how big the temple would be, no matter how beautiful Solomon laid it with gold, or even the tabernacle that we were looking at, there's no such thing as a building that can absolutely show the splendor of God's beauty, right? And also, a temple built by human hands in itself cannot contain the glory of God, right? If God were to dwell in a temple, one temple, and stay there, then our God is not infinite. Our God can be sized up, right? But why does God choose to be worshipped in the temples, or in the temple, in the tabernacle? Why? What do y'all think? In as much as God looks at Solomon and his dad, and he tells him, that is nothing compared to who my great splendor. But he still goes ahead and does it. He allows for him to be worshipped in the temple in Jerusalem, or in the tabernacle back in the days that we were looking at. Why would God do that? Yes, ma'am.
I think it was so the people could have, I think it was to help the people prepare their hearts to worship God.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just wherever they were, like, they set aside a time and they practiced that discipline. And then it also, the way that God structured the temple teaches us a lot about his character and the promises that he's made.
That's good. That's good. Somebody else?
I think he knows that we have a hard time with a purely spiritual relationship. Like, he knows that we need some sort of physical thing to maybe focus on, or to like drive our attention towards him, as opposed to just being us and God.
Good points. Good points. Anybody else want to add to that? If we didn't have this, if there was no such thing as a church building, for us, let's say, let's assume in the great Americas we don't have church buildings. What would that do for your faith? Would your faith grow, or would that hurt your faith in one form or fashion? What do y'all think?
The fellowship or the accountability, aspect of it. You're not able to grow and help others grow, nor, have people look in, maybe see if there's some stuff going wrong, everything in there. And you still have resources, and I guess, but you don't really have a way to easily put that into action. There's a lot of those things you're called to do that you really wouldn't be able to at that point.
That's good. That's good. Somebody else? If we did not have the sacraments that we do, sacraments, so put in prayer, Holy Communion, giving, like JJ was talking about, all of that. If we did not have those sacraments that remind us of God, would our faith grow or not? Why did Jesus look at the disciples and tell them, as often as you get together, break bread and drink wine in remembrance of me, in remembrance of me? Why did he not just say, my body is being broken for you and my blood is being shed for you? Just remember that. Why give them sacraments to remember that? So what?
It's good for them.
It's good for them. Yeah, simply put, it's good for them. That's a very good way to put it. The sacraments are good for man, because a lot of times it's hard for man, like Noah said, to fathom the spiritual realm, and man needs a physical representation of what's going on the outside. You pick up on that? Hence, I conclude this lesson that I started 3 months ago, that I submit that any church that teaches you that you can be a Christian without going to church is wrong for you. Any faith that teaches you that you can be a Christian on your own is lying to you. Unless, in some case, there's some situations, obviously, where it's what's necessary. If you're living in persecution, that's understandable. That's very understandable. If you're living in a country where it's illegal, sometimes seclusion of the Christian communities, that's great. But some of the greatest gifts that God has given man is the ability to share in the spiritual by using the physical things that he has blessed us with. God dwells in this building with or without the bed or the whatever JJ thinks in his mind. God has blessed us with the community, and that's why even just stresses that he says that they will know that you're my disciples if you love one another, right? And he tells them, in Hebrews we see, do not give up the habit of, Hebrews 10, do not give up the habit of meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. Can God be worshipped anywhere? Yes. Right? Can God be worshipped anywhere? Yes. But is God honored when people come into his house to worship him? By all means, yes. By all means, it's yes. And not almost sound almost religious. I've always said religiosity is a good thing. Not to sound religious, but for some denominations, actually not going to church is seen as a sin. When I was growing up, I reached some point where people were telling me, "Oh, you don't have to go to church to be a Christian," and I was like, "Yeah, that's true. I mean, 100%. You don't have to engage in the community to stay Christian." Yeah, fair. But you can see the fruits of the Spirit in somebody's life by how attracted they are to the things of God, and that includes church attendance, doing what God has required of you to do. It is a very, very strong indication of, our attitude for God. A person who tells you, "Nah, just go do what you want to do," I don't think that person is looking out for your spiritual well-being. One of the greatest ways when we do mission trips in Africa and whatever I've always taught, I love baptizing people. That's a great thing. I love bringing people to Jesus. But every person that you bring to Jesus, unless you get them plugged into a community, if you give them enough time, they will fall away, right? So as you're doing mission work, that one of the best things you can do for people is to show them Jesus, show them who God is, lead them to the Lord, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, get them conscripted into God's army, but plug them into a temple somewhere. That is usually how people maintain their faith. You know that kind of like it reminds me of the parable of the sower who spread the seed. You know. being not going to church and getting plugged in is like the seed that fell among the thorns. It sprouts and then the thorns choke it out. So God thought it smart and wise to tell the disciples, the Israelites, have a tabernacle where you shall worship, where you shall sacrifice. And he made it very strict. You shall observe this on such and such and such a day. Jesus went to church. Did you know that? Jesus did not miss going to the synagogue, and he's the Son of God. Interesting. But also, and I'm about to introduce a new book today. But also looking at the accounts in the Old Testament. Who remembers what I talked about when I mentioned altars in the sacrificial system before the temple? What did I say? Or before the tabernacle? Do you remember? It was a long time ago. What were God's instructions when it came to like building altars and sacrificing on altars?
Like the structure of the altars, or like the things that you brought?
Well, I guess I didn't fashion the question. that is a good observation. When it came to, I'm going to answer my own question because I don't know how to like pose it. From Genesis, we see people sacrificing, right? In different patterns, different forms, right? We will look eventually at Abraham about to sacrifice his own son, right? So we know that human sacrifice is not well. It's not good, but we can see that it's been happening before, right? Because Abraham said, "Okay, I'll do it," right? That's fair. That's a fair observation, right? Because if it wasn't common, then everyone would be like, "Oh God, what the heck?" Like, right? But praise the Lord that He just did it. But we know that human sacrifice is very common at the time. But people would built up high places all over the place, right? If you read through, beginning from like, I want to say like maybe Exodus, maybe even later, through Judges for sure. If you read through Judges, going through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, blah, 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 you'll see multiple places where God tells them, destroy the high places. They keep saying the high places. What are the high places? Sacrificial sites, right? In the times of Moses, he instructs them and tells them, you shall not sacrifice to me. God telling them, you shall not sacrifice anywhere but the temple or the tabernacle of the town. I mentioned that before. Why would God direct the whole congregation to one spot as the one system that they were supposed to follow? There's a lot of reasons, right? Big one being, if people were allowed to keep sacrificing at the different high places, it wouldn't be long before they would sacrifice to other gods. They would mingle sacrificial system of God's sacrificial systems, Yahweh, I'm going to use Yahweh's sacrificial systems with the systems of the Canaanites. And at some point, it will be hard to distinguish between the two, right? So God can be worshipped at all places, but He says, go to the temple. So, I'm going to conclude the tabernacle at that, unless if you guys have any questions. Any questions that I could like clarify on? Good. The sacrifice has not stopped up to this day. There's still sacrifice happening in the house of God. It's just not at the tabernacle or the temple. Even up to now, God requires us to sacrifice daily our hearts, our time, our resources. Christ died 2,040 years ago, and His sacrifice is still being, well, I guess you could almost technically say He's still being sacrificed up today. It's an eternal sacrifice that keeps going on. It never stopped. It's just that we had a perfect one that kind of covered all times, right? And like I said before, on the judgment day, people will be in trouble with God because they did not honor the perfect sacrifice. Honor the perfect sacrifice. All right, I'm going to end on that. I want to go to something else. Typically, when I've taught Sunday class, I've taught biblical books. And I know for the past 3 months, I kind of lumped a lot of books into an amalgamation of the things that I've been teaching. Usually, I'll go between Old Testament and New Testament. But I thought it would be smart, since we talked about the sacrificial system, and I kept talking about like the identity of God. Remember when I kept saying before God gives them the sacrificial system, He wants first build their identity in Him. They need first to know who God is. They need first to know who Yahweh is before they can follow this very strict system. So I was thinking maybe what I could do now, I would love to go to Genesis and talk about how did that flow from the beginning all the way to the Exodus, right? And so that we can know how Yahweh was operating, how they understood God, what God did before the Israelites in Exodus came and said, all right, we will follow God. But I wanted to give you the option. Are y'all cool with that, or do y'all want me to look at another book? Okay, cool, we're cool with that. All right, let us go to Genesis chapter 1. Also remember, these classes are not incredibly dense that I'll give you all the information. You have to go back and read this stuff by yourself. I'll be lumping chapters all together. All right? And so what I want you to do is go back home and read. It's narrative. This is narrative reading, which I think is very, very interesting. If you were to like read Genesis, it's not written as the epistles. The epistles is very instructional. And sometimes it's hard for people to like read 1 Corinthians. Sometimes it's hard for like people to follow doctrine. But this is story. Boom, boom, boom. Which is pretty cool. But as you read, you're going to see that I'm going to skip some things, like when it comes to like the Nephilim. I might briefly talk about the Nephilim, but I'm not going to dwell onto who the sons of God were. Okay? So that's stuff that you can look up on your own. Can angels have sex with human beings? Well, I've never seen that happen, but how did this happen in the Bible? So all that interesting stuff. You've never heard of the Nephilim?
Oh.
The Nephilim. They're called the giants of old. Some people believe that Goliath was a descendant of these. Let me find it for you. Hey guys. Hey guys. Everybody. Shh. Genesis 6. This is off topic, but Genesis 6. I'll pull it up for you. Also, I like I've told you before, when I teach, sometimes I teach almost with this thinking that you have heard these stories before. And if you haven't, you can always tell me what is that, and I'll go back. There it is. This is what I'm talking about. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives as they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not dwell in man forever, for he is flesh, his day shall be 120. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. What does it mean when it says the sons of God? Angels or demons? Well, demons and angels are kind of like the same material. One is evil, one is not. So you would imagine these are spiritual beings. And when it says came to the daughters of men, that means sexual intercourse. That's how biblical language is. When it says, and they took their wives as any chose, that means they were somehow able to cohabit with man. And whenever they gave birth to was some unnatural beings that were called the Nephilim. So you can look that up on your own at some point. Crazy, huh? Weird, right?
Let's just keep reading this one.
So what?
Let's just keep reading this part. Let's go a little further.
Let's start first. Let's start first. And then we can talk about that later. All right, so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said that there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. Interesting. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let there be waters under the heavens let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place. Let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. Watch how many times it says, and it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning. I'm going to skip. Verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. He created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath, I have given every green plant food. And it was so. And God saw that everything he had made, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. And then God rested on the seventh day. Notice this. Some things that some people have never noticed because we read through these texts. Pretty cool. A lot of theologians have theologized and said, in the beginning, man was made to be vegan. Y'all catch up on that? Well, which one is the only way they don't eat any animal products? Vegan. Oh, cool. Because in the beginning he tells them, behold, verse 29, which is kind of tiny. Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. But the beasts, the animals, they shall eat the plants. So people have always said, in the beginning, man was made to only eat plants. What do y'all think?
Well, doesn't verse 28 kind of contradict that? Because he says they have dominion over the fish of the sea and birds of the heaven, through dominion, that kind of seems to, show that we're at least a certain higher there. And it doesn't directly, say whether or not we should or shouldn't eat them, but I just think it's kind of more, it's explicitly said for one instead of the other, but I feel like that may kind of fall under that dominion part, 28.
Yes, you could read it that way, but it doesn't specific. Dominion is usually used to denote some kind of rule or hierarchy, right? If I have dominion over you, I rule over you. Sometimes you can argue and say, well, that doesn't mean necessarily means more important, but in this case, more important. Man was created more important than a fig tree or I don't know, a chihuahua. But So it doesn't really say you shall eat them, but this one specifically says here's your source of nourishment, right? And I'm not arguing for veganism. If you're a vegan, more power to you. But you don't see an animal dying until the fall, right? So you won't see an animal being at least in this story, until God kills one of the animals to clothe Adam and Eve. Interesting, right? And I'm not supporting either. I think we should eat animals. I love eating animals. That's not what I'm arguing for. I could be a vegan if it wasn't for the occasional steak. Man, this thing is so good. But there's that. Second question. In the beginning, what is the beginning talking about? The beginning of what? That's good. The creation? What goes into creation? You got to define what creation is. For the universe is more specific because I'm assuming like the cosmos, right? The Pluto, whatever, all that. The Milky Way, cosmos, right? The universe, right? And what did you say, Tegan? Creation. What do you put in creation? The earth, yes. That is true. So both of y'all are correct. So I mean, if God created the stars and the sun, that's cosmic objects, right? In creation, we have the plants, the birds, blah, blah, blah. What I don't see in here is where Satan comes from. Or the angels. So is this beginning specifically talking about worldly and planetary creation? Or does this also mention anything to do with spiritual beings? Would it be fair to assume that the spiritual beings have already been created at this point? Right? So Satan has already done his bad deeds, right? Because in chapter 2, you're going to see Satan come to tempt men and women. So unless if we're thinking, well, God created the world, and then Adam and Eve, and as they were dwelling in the garden, somewhere in there, Satan has fallen and has taken a third of the angels with him, and boom, they come to tempt man, right? You could think that, but the timeline doesn't seem to suggest that. So we can assume that Satan has already been cast out of heaven by this point. Yes, sir?
In Revelation, doesn't it say that all the war and stuff already happened before this? Like it happened before this stuff?
Not really. In Revelation, it seems to cast a picture of the future. He seems to think of it as upcoming, right? That makes sense? It seems to think like it's about to unfold. At least most of it. Yeah. Unless if you look at like the picture of the dragon that's chasing the woman with her child, and he vomits water to swallow her, and the earth opens up and swallows. There's a lot of that imagery, but at this point I guess you can make that point now that I think about it. You can make the point that maybe Revelation was pointing to that, right? But we don't have any information indicating what's taking place before. Another observation, and this is where Christians sometimes get themselves into dicey situations. God created the world in how many days? Everything. 6 days. 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh day, right? On each day he made some kind of part of creation, one by one. Yes, Sam?
So God created rest like on the seventh day, but why do some youth groups do stupid all-nighters then if God gave us rest on the seventh day? I mean, did God give us all-nighters? I mean, what's the point of it?
That's a good question. So I would answer that question by invoking some of the parables that Jesus brought when he said the Sabbath was made for man and not meant for the Sabbath, right? You should take a Sabbath. But also, I mean, technically speaking, the Sabbath is Saturday, right? So it's not Sunday, so we should not be here. If we were observing the actual Sabbath, it would be Saturday. Yes. Yeah, so we should be doing church yesterday. So it's a lot of stuff, but maybe, hopefully I can answer that later. Y'all have heard of Darwinism, right? and the Big Bang Theory. Have you heard of the theory that, matter cannot be, we have a physicist, cannot be created or destroyed. And isn't maybe it's not Darwinism, but scientists believe that in the beginning there was nothing until there was like.
Yeah, they thought it was all in one single point.
You see what I just did? Can y'all see the dot that I have? I mean, y'all have heard that, right? I'm not saying science. The Big Bang Theory, it began from just one single dot that expanded and boom. There's Pluto, there's Earth, there's man, right? I mean, with evolution, man came from apes and rats. We keep getting bigger, blah, blah, blah. I have told you before about the evolution of the human pelvis, right? Yeah. The human head gets bigger continually bigger every year. That's just how it is. Like babies' heads. Like our heads are not the same as how they were thousands of years ago, but the female pelvis has not increased with the same speed as how much the heads are getting bigger, so it's harder for women to give birth the older the birth goes. Interesting, right? So, in conclusion, how many of you guys have heard of evolutionary deism? Right? And so what it's basically saying is combining the fact that scientists believe that the world was made from evolution, like man was from evolution. He evolved from one singular cell and became where we are. And the world, the cosmos, Big Bang, boom. And so sometimes Christians have a hard time believing in a 6-day creation narrative because they're like, how can God do that in one day? And so they've combined evolution with deism. Deism has to do with God. And so they've said maybe what's actually happening here when the Bible says on the first day God created the expanse. What that means is that day is an equivalent of several million years. I don't know how to write millions.
Yeah.
Right? And so they've said what you're actually reading in the Bible is, I guess, symbolic in a way. In our terms, it's a day, but it's millions of years, right? And so they've combined deism, the belief in God, with evolution in order to explain Genesis. What do y'all think?
It's tempting.
Very tempting.
I played around with the idea for a while because I was thinking about it because you can do this. I did this once, and you can break up from the time that the universe started to Earth and it's set in equal places. You have to insert the verse where it says to a day to God is like 1,000 years, 1,000 a day. So you have to play with the whole weird time thing, and you have to say, well, the Jews counted days differently than we did, so to them, how they figured it gets weird. But there are people who I don't know anymore, but
That's true. In conclusion, so this brings in the argument of New Earth, Old Earth. Have you heard of those terms before? New Earth means the world has been there for approximately, to be on the safe side, maybe 5,600 years. Most times it's placed at 3,600. Right? That's how old the Earth is. So New Earth. So Old Earth would mean the cosmos has been happening for millions of years. So Old Earth would kind of take into consideration evolution. So millions of years, right? Well, this one is more what the Bible supports. And I want to conclude on this without giving you answers. Is God capable of creating everything in a day? Right? What do y'all think?
Yes, absolutely.
He's God, right? This kind of, I've read into it, and I can see why they would think that. But one of the things that we struggle with as Christians is always trying to find scientific explanation for every single thing that we do. For everything that happens, I got to explain the Bible. Maybe it was the right ingredients, the atmospheric pressure, blah, 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 and that's why the miracle happens, right? I personally believe in a younger earth. narrative because I believe that God is capable of creating the world in just a day. Right? So one defends God, one explains God. And, well, in a way. So, conclusion. Go home and study about, do whatever. But I want to, when I talk about the Bible, I'll be thinking of a young earth theory because God is a God. He can do that. Okay? Yeah. All right. Y'all free to go.